A racist man accuses a young black teenager of stealing packages. When the police arrive, he is hit with karma. Isaiah Washington kept his head down, eyes focused on the cracks in the pavement. It was the safest way to walk through the neighborhood. Not that he had much reason to be in this part of town, but it was the quickest route home after school. The sidewalks here were pristine, lined with neatly trimmed hedges and carefully pruned lawns, the houses towering like sentinels, judging anyone who didn't belong. Isaiah felt the weight of the neighborhood pressing down on him, the eyes he couldn't see but knew were there, watching from behind curtains or over fences. He shifted his backpack, pulling the strap higher onto his shoulder, his sketchbook tucked tightly under his arm. It had been a long day. Math test, an argument with Malik about some stupid movie, and now this sense of dread creeping into his chest. He quickened his pace. He didn't want to be here any longer than necessary. Every step felt heavier than the last, like walking through molasses. Isaiah wasn't afraid of this neighborhood. He just knew how easily things could go wrong. He had seen it happen too many times on the news. A young black boy in the wrong place at the wrong time, misunderstood, misjudged, mistreated. He didn't want to be the next one. As he rounded the corner by the house with the gaudy white pillars, he noticed the man sitting on the porch. Mr. Holcomb. Isaiah had seen him before, a grizzled, older man, his white hair thinning under a faded baseball cap. He always seemed to be out there, watching everything like it was his job. Isaiah didn't know what Mr. Holcomb did for a living, but the man had that look of someone who had lived in this neighborhood for decades, someone who believed it belonged to him. Isaiah felt Mr. Holcomb's gaze on him before he saw the man shift in his chair, his body stiffening. It was an unmistakable tension that shot through the air. Isaiah's steps faltered for just a moment, but he kept walking. He wasn't doing anything wrong. This was the shortest route home. He was just a kid walking from school. Still, he felt that gnawing anxiety clawing at his insides. "Hey!" The voice cut through the still afternoon air like a knife. Isaiah's stomach dropped, but he didn't stop walking. He wasn't getting into this. Not today. "Hey, you!" Mr. Holcomb's voice grew louder, more insistent. Isaiah could hear the scrape of the chair as the man stood, the creak of old bones shifting under a lifetime of weight. Isaiah's heart raced in his chest. He didn't know if he should stop or keep going, but his legs made the decision for him. He moved faster, his sneakers slapping against the sidewalk as he focused on the street ahead. Behind him, he heard the unmistakable sound of a phone dialing. The dread in his gut solidified into a knot. Isaiah kept walking. Maybe it wasn't about him. Maybe Mr. Holcomb wasn't talking to him. But he knew better. His mother had always told him to be careful in places like this, where the smallest misunderstanding could turn into something bigger, something dangerous. But he wasn't doing anything wrong. That thought kept repeating in his head. He wasn't doing anything wrong. By the time Isaiah reached the next corner, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, a text from Malik lighting up the screen. Something about meeting up later. Isaiah didn't even read it. His hand was shaking as he shoved the phone back into his pocket, glancing behind him. That was when he saw the squad car. It rolled down the street slowly, the flashing lights a stark contrast to the otherwise peaceful neighborhood. The knot in Isaiah's stomach twisted harder. The car pulled up next to him, tires grinding to a halt. His mouth went dry as the passenger window slid down with a mechanical hum. "Hey, kid!" The officer leaned out the window. He was in his 40s, maybe, his face lined with a permanent scowl, eyes hidden behind reflective sunglasses. "Come here for a second." Isaiah froze. His heart pounded in his ears, the adrenaline making his limbs feel heavy and sluggish. "Is there a problem, officer?" Isaiah's voice came out weaker than he intended, a thin thread of sound in the charged air. "Got a call about some packages going missing around here. You mind telling me what you're doing in this neighborhood?" The officer's tone was casual, but Isaiah could hear the underlying suspicion. "I'm just walking home from school," Isaiah replied, keeping his voice steady, though every nerve in his body was telling him to run. The officer glanced at the backpack, then at the sketchbook in Isaiah's hand. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at him, assessing, deciding. Isaiah shifted, uncomfortable under the scrutiny. His mind raced, every lesson his mother had ever taught him flashing through his thoughts. Stay calm. Be polite. Don't make sudden movements. Don't give them a reason. The officer glanced at his partner, who nodded, Mind if we check your bag? Isaiah hesitated. He wanted to say no. He knew he had the right to refuse, but something in the officer's expression told him that wasn't an option. He slowly shrugged off his backpack, his hands shaking as he handed it over. The officer unzipped it, rummaging through the notebooks and pencils, glancing at Isaiah every few seconds. When he found nothing, he tossed the bag back to Isaiah without a word. The knot in Isaiah's stomach loosened slightly, but it didn't disappear. "You live around here?" the officer asked, his voice still carrying that edge. "No, sir, I live a few blocks over, just walking home." The officer didn't respond immediately. He looked at Isaiah for a long time, his jaw tight, like he was weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. "All right, get going, and stay out of trouble." Isaiah didn't move at first, his feet rooted to the sidewalk, but the officer's cold gaze made him snap out of it. He grabbed his backpack and started walking again, his legs unsteady beneath him. He didn't look back, not at the police car, not at Mr. Holcomb, who he could feel still watching from his porch. The whole neighborhood felt like it was watching him, waiting for him to make one wrong move. When he finally reached his house, his hands were trembling as he fumbled with the key. He stepped inside and leaned against the door, trying to steady his breathing. His mother wasn't home yet, which was a small relief. She didn't need to see him like this, shaken, angry, humiliated. Isaiah slumped against the wall, staring at the floor. He hadn't done anything wrong, but it didn't matter. He'd seen it in the officer's eyes, in the way Mr. Holcomb had watched him, like he was guilty before he even opened his mouth. And he knew this wasn't over. Isaiah hadn't said a word to anyone about what happened. Not yet. He thought about it as he sat on his bed later that evening, his sketchbook open but untouched beside him. His fingers itched to draw, to put something on the page that would make sense of everything swirling around in his head, but nothing came. His mind was blank, like the paper in front of him. The memory of the cop's voice, cool and detached, ran through his thoughts on a loop. Stay out of trouble. Like he was the trouble. Like just walking home made him dangerous. A knock on his bedroom door startled him. His mother, Angela, stepped inside, her face set in that tight, careful expression she wore when she knew something was wrong, but was waiting for him to say it first. "How was your day?" she asked, sitting on the edge of his bed. Isaiah shrugged. "Fine." Angela looked at him, her eyes narrowing. She didn't believe him. "You sure?" There was no point lying to her. She always knew. Isaiah rubbed a hand over his face, trying to ease the tension in his muscles. He hadn't wanted to worry her, but he knew that holding it in was making him feel worse. "Something happened today," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Angela's posture shifted, her back straightening as she listened. She waited, giving him the space to say what he needed to. "I was walking home from school, and this man, Mr. Holcomb, you know him? He called the police on me." Isaiah swallowed hard, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "They thought I stole some packages. I didn't. But they still—" He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. "They searched my bag, treated me like I did something wrong." Angela didn't speak for a long moment, her face tightening with barely contained anger. "Did they arrest you?" "No." Isaiah's voice wavered. "They let me go, but it doesn't feel like it's over, like they were waiting for me to mess up." Angela stood abruptly, pacing the small room. She rubbed her hands together like she was trying to wring out the frustration. "I'm calling the station," she said, her voice steely. "This is exactly what I warned you about." Isaiah winced. He didn't want this to turn into a bigger thing. "Mom, it's fine. They didn't do anything, really. I'm home. It's over." Angela spun on him, her eyes fierce. "No, Isaiah, it's not fine. Just because they didn't arrest you doesn't mean it's fine. They had no right to treat you like that, and Mr. Holcomb—" She broke off, shaking her head in disbelief. "I can't believe this. That man has lived in this neighborhood longer than anyone. And he just—" She let out a harsh breath. "They can't get away with this. Not this time." Isaiah stared at the floor, his stomach churning. He didn't want to be the focus of a fight. He didn't want people looking at him, talking about him. But his mother was already pulling out her phone, determination etched in every line of her face. "I'll call Officer Briggs. He'll make sure they review the footage from the neighborhood. There are cameras all over that street, and if Holcomb accused you without any proof, they'll have to do something about it." Isaiah wanted to argue, to tell her to let it go. He could already feel the anxiety building in his chest. The thought of everyone in the neighborhood knowing about this made his skin crawl. But he knew Angela. She wasn't going to let this slide, not after what they'd been through before. Angela paced the room, phone pressed to her ear as she waited for the officer to answer. "Yes, Officer Briggs, this is Angela Washington. I need to report an incident involving my son, Isaiah. He was stopped by officers earlier today on the basis of a false accusation." Isaiah tuned out the rest of the conversation. His mind wandered back to the moment the police had pulled up next to him, the way his body had frozen, how every part of him screamed to run, even though he knew that would only make things worse. His fingers dug into the blanket beneath him. He wasn't sure if he was angry, scared, or a twisted mix of both. Angela finished the call and sat back down next to him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "They're going to review the footage," she said, her voice softer now. "We'll get this sorted, I promise." Isaiah nodded, but it didn't feel like a promise she could keep. Even if they proved he hadn't done anything, that wasn't going to make the feeling go away. That sinking feeling that people saw him as a threat before they even knew him. That no matter what he did or didn't do, there were people who would always think the worst of him. Angela stood again, pacing like she couldn't keep still. "We need to talk to the neighbors, too. I'll make sure they know what happened, that it was a lie. You don't deserve to have them looking at you like—" She stopped, shaking her head. "Like you're some kind of criminal." Isaiah flinched at the word. "I don't want to make it worse, Mom." Angela turned, her expression softening. "Isaiah, it's not about making it worse. It's about making it right. They're not going to get away with making you feel like you don't belong. This is your home just as much as it's theirs." Isaiah wanted to believe her, but the memory of Mr. Holcomb's cold, hard eyes burned in his mind. He wasn't sure anything could make this right. The following day, Isaiah could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. It was in the looks his classmates gave him, in the whispers that seemed to follow him down the hallway. He kept his head low, trying to ignore the way people glanced at him out of the corners of their eyes like they weren't sure what to think. By lunch, he couldn't take it anymore. He found Malik at their usual spot near the art room and sat down heavily beside him. Malik looked up from his phone, his brow furrowed. "Hey man, you good?" Isaiah didn't answer right away, just stared at the ground. "Did you hear?" Malik sighed, putting his phone down. "Yeah, it's all over the place. People talking about how you almost got arrested and stuff." Isaiah's stomach twisted. "I didn't do anything. I was just walking home." "I know." Malik's voice was calm, steady, like he was trying to reassure him. "I believe you, and the people who matter believe you." Isaiah wasn't sure he believed that. "Doesn't feel like it." Malik shrugged. "People are going to talk. Doesn't mean you got to listen to them." Isaiah nodded, but it didn't ease the tension in his chest. "My mom's talking to the cops. She's getting them to check the footage." "Good," Malik said. "They need to know that old man's full of it. You're not going to let him get away with this, right?" Isaiah didn't respond right away. He didn't want to admit it, but part of him just wanted to let it all go, to pretend it hadn't happened. Maybe if he didn't push back, it would all fade away, and people would stop looking at him like he was guilty. But Malik saw through him. "You can't let this slide, man. If you do, they'll just keep thinking they can treat you like that." Isaiah clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. I don't want to make things worse." "You didn't make things worse," Malik said firmly. "He did. They did. You can't just let them get away with it." Isaiah's throat tightened. He wasn't sure what to do. It felt like the ground was slipping beneath him, and he didn't know how to hold on. But Malik's words stuck with him, echoing in his mind long after they'd finished lunch. As Isaiah walked home that day, taking the long way around to avoid Mr. Holcomb's street, he realized something. No matter what he did, people were going to see him how they wanted to. Staying quiet wouldn't make that go away. But maybe, just maybe, speaking up would. Isaiah hadn't gone back to the neighborhood route since the incident. He took the longer way home now, zigzagging through unfamiliar streets just to avoid walking past Mr. Holcomb's house again. It added nearly 20 minutes to his walk, but it felt safer, less heavy. But no matter where he went, the weight of what had happened stayed with him, a constant presence lingering at the edge of his mind. The first few days after his mom spoke with the police were tense. He waited for something, an apology, A knock at the door from someone saying it was all a mistake. Anything to make the tension in his chest go away. But all that came was silence. In the cafeteria, Malik sat across from him, fidgeting with his phone. "So, did your mom hear anything back from the cops?" Isaiah shrugged, pushing his food around on the tray. "Not really. She said they're looking into the footage, but that's all." "They better hurry up." Malik leaned in, his voice low. "People are still talking about it, you know." Isaiah didn't want to know. He didn't want to hear about the whispers that followed him down the hall, or the sideways glances in class. He just wanted to be left alone. "Have you talked to Troy?" Malik asked, glancing toward the other end of the cafeteria. Isaiah shook his head. "No. Man, I thought y'all were tight." "We were." Isaiah tried to keep his voice calm, but he could feel the tension creeping in. Not anymore. He hadn't heard from Troy since the incident. No texts, no calls, nothing. Isaiah wasn't sure if Troy believed the rumors or if he just didn't want to get involved. Either way, the silence hurt more than the whispers. "Forget him," Malik said, his voice hardening. "You don't need people like that. If he can't stand by you when you need him, then he's not your friend." Isaiah wanted to agree, but the loss of a friend stung deeper than he wanted to admit. "It's whatever." Malik leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Look, you've got people who believe you. Your mom, me, a few other folks at school. You can't let the rest of them get in your head." Isaiah knew Malik was trying to be encouraging, but it didn't make the gnawing sense of isolation any easier. Even if a few people believed him, the rest of the world still felt like it was watching, waiting for him to mess up. Later that afternoon, Isaiah sat on the porch of his house, sketchbook in hand. He hadn't drawn in days, and the empty pages taunted him. The pen in his hand felt heavy, awkward, like a foreign object he didn't know how to use anymore. Drawing had always been his escape, a way to make sense of the world when everything felt too loud, too chaotic. But now, the lines wouldn't come. He stared at the blank page until his vision blurred. The frustration bubbled inside him, simmering just below the surface. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke his concentration. He looked up to see his mom stepping out, her face tense, phone in hand. She caught his eye and walked over, her expression serious. "Isaiah," she started, her voice low. "I just got off the phone with Officer Briggs." Isaiah's stomach dropped. He didn't know if he wanted to hear what came next. "They reviewed the footage from the neighborhood. It shows Mr. Holcomb taking the packages." Isaiah blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. "What?" Angela nodded, her eyes sharp with a mix of anger and satisfaction. "They've got him on camera. It's all there. Him sneaking around and taking people's packages. He's been doing it for months." For a second, Isaiah didn't know how to feel. Relief, maybe, or disbelief. Mr. Holcomb had been the one stealing the packages this whole time. It felt surreal, like a twist in a story he didn't expect. "So, what happens now?" he asked quietly. "They're going to arrest him," Angela said, her voice steady. "He's going to have to face the consequences, and they're going to clear your name, officially." Isaiah exhaled slowly, his muscles relaxing slightly. It was what he'd wanted, right? For the truth to come out. For everyone to see that he wasn't the thief, that he hadn't done anything wrong. But as the news settled in, it didn't bring the relief he expected. There was no sense of victory, no weight lifting from his shoulders. Angela sat down next to him, her hand resting on his knee. "I know this has been hard, baby, but it's almost over. People will know the truth." Isaiah nodded, though he wasn't sure what the truth even meant anymore. The damage had already been done, hadn't it? The stares, the whispers, they wouldn't disappear just because Mr. Holcomb was arrested. People had already made up their minds about him, and proving his innocence wouldn't change that. "Are you okay?" Angela's voice was soft, her concern evident. "I guess," Isaiah muttered, running a hand over his face. "It's just, I don't know. I thought it would feel better." Angela squeezed his knee gently. "It's okay to feel that way. You went through something traumatic, and it's not going to disappear just because they arrested the real culprit." Isaiah nodded again, though the hollow feeling in his chest remained. He'd been proven right, but it didn't feel like winning. It felt like surviving. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. Mr. Holcomb had been arrested, and the footage had been shown to several neighbors as part of the investigation. Isaiah could feel the shift in the air the next time he walked through the streets. People didn't stare as much. The whispers had quieted, replaced by murmurs of apology and disbelief about Mr. Holcomb's actions. It didn't make Isaiah feel any better. At school, Malik was waiting for him at lunch, scrolling through his phone with a satisfied smirk. "Dude, have you seen the comments on the local news page? People are ripping Holcomb apart." Isaiah shook his head. "I don't want to see it." "I get that," Malik said, putting his phone down. "But man, it feels good to see people realize they were wrong about you. Even Troy's talking about how messed up it was." Isaiah felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat. Took him long enough. "Yeah, well, people are slow." Malik shrugged. "At least it's over, right?" Isaiah didn't answer. He wasn't sure if it was over. The news might have moved on. The rumors might have died down. But the feeling inside him hadn't gone away. He still felt like he was walking on eggshells, waiting for the next thing to go wrong. Later that day, as Isaiah walked home, taking the longer route as usual, he spotted something out of the corner of his eye. Across the street, a few of his neighbors were gathered, talking in hushed tones. They didn't look at him, but Isaiah knew they were talking about Mr. Holcomb, about him. He slowed his pace, watching them for a moment. One of the women glanced up, catching his eye. She quickly looked away, but Isaiah saw the hesitation in her movements, the awkwardness, the unspoken judgment that still lingered. He kept walking, his chest tight. When he got home, Angela was on the phone again, her voice sharp. He didn't need to ask who she was talking to. It was probably the police again, or maybe the local news. She'd been making calls all week, making sure everyone knew Isaiah's name was cleared. Isaiah went straight to his room, closing the door behind him. The sketchbook sat on his desk, the pages still blank. He stared at it for a long time, his fingers itching to pick up the pen. But the desire to draw was buried beneath the weight of everything that had happened. He lay down on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The truth was out, but nothing felt right. The neighborhood buzzed with the news of Mr. Holcomb's arrest. For days, it was all anyone talked about. How the man everyone thought was their trustworthy neighbor had been stealing from them for months. The local news even covered the story, turning it into another segment about suburban crime. Yet despite the whirlwind of attention, Isaiah felt like he was stuck in the eye of the storm, unmoving while everything around him changed. His name had been cleared, sure, but that didn't erase the looks he still got at school. The apologies he received were awkward, forced. Even Malik had stopped bringing up Mr. Holcomb around him, sensing that Isaiah didn't want to talk about it. It didn't help that a few days later, Mr. Holcomb had been released on bail. He was back home, hidden away behind drawn curtains and a closed front door, but his presence loomed over the neighborhood like a dark shadow. Isaiah hadn't dared walk down that street since the incident, but he imagined what it must feel like for the people who lived there, the same people who had been ready to believe Isaiah was guilty without a second thought. It was strange. Isaiah didn't feel angry at Mr. Holcomb anymore, or even at the police. What bothered him most now was the silence, the way people acted like it was over, like everything had been set right just because the truth had come out. Isaiah knew better. The truth wasn't enough. At school, things were quiet for a while. People moved on, found new things to gossip about, and Isaiah started to hope that maybe, just maybe, he could get back to his normal life. But that hope shattered the moment he walked into his art class one afternoon. As he took his seat in the back of the room, a few students across the room exchanged glances. Isaiah caught snippets of their conversation, though they weren't being particularly quiet. "I heard he's still under house arrest," one girl said, her voice low but pointed. "Yeah, but they'll probably let him off easy. Old guys like that don't go to jail for long," another student added with a smirk. Isaiah stared at the blank page in front of him, his pencil hovering over the paper. He didn't want to hear it, didn't want to know what they thought of Mr. Holcomb, or what might happen next. Then, one of the students, a tall boy with shaggy hair, leaned back in his chair and snorted. "I bet the kid doesn't feel so good now, huh? Everyone knows he didn't do it, but he's still walking around like people care." The words hit Isaiah like a punch to the gut. His pencil snapped in his hand, the pieces clattering onto the desk. He stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor, causing the whole room to look his way. The students who had been talking fell silent, their faces a mix of surprise and embarrassment. Isaiah felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him angry. Without a word, he grabbed his bag and stormed out of the classroom, his footsteps echoing through the hallway. The walk home felt longer than usual that day. Isaiah took the same long route he'd been using for weeks, but the familiar streets felt different. Everything felt heavier, the air thick with a sense of unresolved tension. As he turned the corner toward his block, he froze. There, just a few houses down, stood Mr. Holcomb. The old man was standing on his porch, his eyes scanning the street like he had every right to be there, like nothing had changed. Isaiah's heart pounded in his chest, a rush of heat flooding his veins. For a moment he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, staring at the man who had tried to destroy his life. Mr. Holcomb didn't seem to notice him, but it didn't matter. The sight of the man was enough to send Isaiah's thoughts spiraling. He'd thought the arrest would be the end of it, that once the truth came out, the tension would dissipate. But here was Mr. Holcomb, free as ever, while Isaiah still felt trapped. Isaiah turned on his heel and walked the other way, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He couldn't go home. Not yet. Not like this. Isaiah ended up at Malik's house. His best friend let him in without asking any questions, though he clearly saw the storm of emotions brewing behind Isaiah's eyes. They sat in silence for a while, Malik waiting for Isaiah to speak first. "I saw him," Isaiah finally muttered, his voice thick with barely contained anger. "Who?" Malik asked, though he already knew the answer. "Holcomb. He was standing there like nothing happened." Malik leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Man, I told you this wasn't over. Just because they caught him doesn't mean things will change." "I know that," Isaiah snapped, the frustration spilling out. "But it feels like everything's wrong, like I'm the one who's still paying for it, and he's just out there free." Malik nodded slowly, his eyes serious. "That's how it always goes, man. People like him get away with it because the system lets them. You think they're going to throw some old white dude in jail for stealing packages? Nah, they'll slap him on the wrist and let him go." Isaiah clenched his fists, the injustice of it all sitting like a weight in his chest. "I just want it to be over." "It's not going to be over, not for a while," Malik said, his voice quiet but firm. "But you can't let it eat you up. That's what they want, for you to be pissed off and broken. You got to find a way to live through it." Isaiah stared at the floor, his hands still shaking. He wanted to scream, to punch something, to make the world understand how wrong everything felt. But Malik was right. There was no point in getting angry. It wouldn't change anything. The next day, Isaiah's mom called him downstairs. Angela stood in the kitchen, her face a mask of concern. "Isaiah, come sit," she said, motioning to the table. He sat down and she slid a piece of paper toward him. It was a letter from the school. "They're canceling your art exhibition," Angela said softly, her eyes dark with anger. Isaiah's heart sank. "What? Why?" Angela sighed, sitting down across from him. "They said it was too sensitive, too political after everything that's happened. They don't want to stir up any more controversy." Isaiah's stomach twisted. His art had been the one thing that helped him get through the worst of it. He'd been looking forward to the exhibition for weeks, hoping it would give him a chance to show people who he really was. Not the kid they whispered about, but the artist who saw the world in colors and lines, not accusations. "And they think canceling it is the answer?" Isaiah's voice shook with anger. Angela reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "I'm going to talk to them, baby. This isn't right." But Isaiah wasn't sure talking would fix anything. It felt like the world was closing in on him from all sides. No matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried to move on, the forces pushing against him were too strong. He was tired of fighting, tired of pretending things would get better. And for the first time, he didn't know if he had the energy to keep going. Isaiah sat in his room, the school's letter still crumpled in his hand, staring at the wall. His art exhibition, the one thing that had kept him grounded during everything, was canceled. It felt like the final straw, as if everything he cared about was slipping away from him. It wasn't just the exhibition being canceled. It was what it meant. They were silencing him, taking away the one outlet he had to express everything that had been swirling inside him since that day on Mr. Holcomb's street. He clenched his jaw, trying to control the simmering anger inside him. Malik's words from the day before echoed in his head. "You can't let it eat you up. That's what they want." But how could he not let it eat him up when it felt like the entire world was conspiring to shut him down? Angela appeared at his door, her face tight with concern. She had clearly seen the letter crumpled in his hand. "Baby, we'll figure this out." Isaiah didn't respond. He was tired of figuring things out, tired of fighting a battle that felt rigged against him from the start. He dropped the letter onto the floor, his hand shaking with frustration. Angela stepped into the room, sitting beside him on the bed. "I know this is hard, but you can't give up. We can still talk to the school, get the exhibition back on track." Isaiah shook his head. "What's the point? They'll just find another excuse to shut me down. I don't even know why I'm bothering." Angela put her hand on his shoulder, her voice steady. "Because you're stronger than this. You're stronger than them." "I'm tired of being strong," Isaiah muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Why do I have to be the one who's always strong? Why can't I just live my life without constantly having to prove myself?" Angela sighed, her hand falling to her lap. "I know it's unfair, and you shouldn't have to fight this hard, but the world we live in doesn't give us that choice. You have to decide how you're going to handle it. You can let it break you, or you can find a way to rise above it." Isaiah didn't know if he could rise above it anymore. Every time he thought he'd gotten through the worst of it, something else knocked him down. He had been innocent, and the truth had come out. But none of that had fixed the damage that had been done. And now, they were taking away his art, the one thing that made him feel like himself. Later that evening, Isaiah lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. His thoughts spun in endless loops, replaying the past few weeks over and over again. Mr. Holcomb's accusation, the police's suspicion, the whispers at school, and now, the school canceling his exhibition because they were too afraid to deal with the fallout. It felt like no matter what he did, the system was designed to push him down. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He reached for it, expecting a message from Malik, but it was from someone else. Troy. "Yo, man, I heard about the exhibition. That's messed up. You good?" Isaiah stared at the message for a moment, unsure how to respond. Troy had been his friend for years, but since the incident, Troy had distanced himself. He hadn't said anything outright, but Isaiah could feel the shift, the hesitance in their interactions. Now suddenly Troy wanted to check in. He typed out a quick reply. "Isaiah, not really, man." He hit send and waited, not expecting much. But Troy replied almost immediately. "Troy, you want to talk about it? I know I haven't been around much, but I got your back." Isaiah's chest tightened. Part of him wanted to tell Troy off for abandoning him when things got tough, but another part of him just felt tired. He didn't have the energy to hold grudges. Not right now. "Isaiah, maybe later." Troy didn't push further, and Isaiah was grateful for that. He put the phone down and stared back up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of his jumbled emotions. The next morning, Isaiah woke up feeling numb. He dragged himself through the motions, shower, breakfast, school, but everything felt distant, like he was moving through a fog. Malik met him at their usual spot near the art room before class, a concerned look on his face. "Man, you look like you didn't sleep at all." Isaiah shrugged. "I didn't." Malik frowned, leaning against the wall. "Look, I know the exhibition thing is a hit, but you can't let them win. You know what I'm saying?" Isaiah crossed his arms, staring at the floor. "What am I supposed to do, Malik? They already won. They shut me down. I can't even show my art. How am I supposed to fight that?" Malik let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "Maybe you don't need their exhibition. Maybe you don't need them at all." Isaiah glanced up, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Malik's eyes lit up with an idea. "I mean, who says you need the school's approval to show your work? You've got people who want to see your art, right? Why don't you do your own exhibition? Do it outside of school. Invite people. Put it on social media. Make it bigger than what they had planned." Isaiah blinked, the gears in his mind slowly turning. "You think that would work?" Malik shrugged, his grin widening. "Man, people want to see your work. You don't need their permission. You do this on your terms." For the first time in days, Isaiah felt a spark of hope. Maybe Malik was right. Maybe he didn't need the school's permission to show his art. Maybe he could take control of his own narrative. But with that spark of hope came a deep sense of fear. What if it didn't work? What if no one showed up? What if he failed? Malik seemed to read the doubt in his expression and clapped him on the shoulder. "Look, I've got your back. We'll do this together. We'll make it big. They won't know what hit them. Isaiah nodded slowly, the idea taking root in his mind. It was risky, but what did he have to lose? The school had already taken away his opportunity. This was his chance to take it back. "All right," Isaiah said quietly. "Let's do it." Malik's grin widened. "That's what I'm talking about." Over the next few days, Isaiah threw himself into planning the exhibition. Malik helped him find a space, a local community center that was happy to host the event. They worked on invites, promoting it on social media, spreading the word. Isaiah's mom even helped with some of the logistics. And for the first time in weeks, Isaiah felt like he was doing something. The exhibition became more than just about showing his art. It was about reclaiming his voice, about refusing to let the world shut him down. As the day of the exhibition approached, Isaiah found himself spending more time in his sketchbook, the ideas flowing again. He poured everything he had into his drawings, capturing the turmoil of the past few months, the fear, the anger, the frustration. Each piece was a reflection of the emotional journey he'd been on, and with every stroke of the pen, he felt a little bit of the weight lifting off his shoulders. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Isaiah felt like he had some control, like he was taking his life back. When the day of the exhibition finally arrived, Isaiah stood in front of the community center, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know how many people would show up. Maybe it would be a huge success. Maybe it would be a total flop. But for the first time in weeks, Isaiah wasn't afraid. He was ready. The community center buzzed with the low hum of conversation, and Isaiah could hardly believe what he was seeing. People were actually showing up. More than he expected. He stood by the entrance, Malik at his side, as a steady stream of visitors trickled through the door. Some were familiar faces, friends from school, neighbors who had offered him awkward apologies in the weeks following the incident. But there were also people Isaiah didn't know, people who had seen the event online or heard about it through word of mouth. He had done it. Without the school's permission, without their approval, he had organized his own exhibition. Malik nudged him, his grin wide. "See? I told you. You didn't need them. Look at all these people." Isaiah gave a small nod, but the knot in his stomach didn't ease. This was it, the moment he had been working toward for weeks. His artwork, his story, was out there for everyone to see. Yet instead of excitement, a sense of dread gnawed at him. What if they didn't understand? What if they didn't get what he was trying to say? He scanned the room, catching glimpses of people pausing at his drawings, leaning in closer to study the lines, the details. Each piece told a part of his story, his frustration, his fear, his anger. One drawing in particular drew most of the attention, a detailed sketch of a street corner, a squad car parked in the background, and a shadowy figure standing on the curb. It wasn't labeled, but anyone who had heard about Isaiah's story would recognize the scene. He watched as two older women stood in front of the drawing, their heads bent together in conversation. They whispered to each other, their expressions serious, before moving on to the next piece. "You all right, man?" Malik asked, sensing Isaiah's tension. Isaiah forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm good. Just nervous, I guess." Malik clapped him on the back. "You got this. They're here because they want to see what you have to say." Isaiah nodded, though he couldn't shake the unease building in his chest. He wandered through the room, watching as people examined his work, some with curiosity, others with a sense of quiet contemplation. And then, he saw them. At the far end of the room, standing near the entrance, were Troy and a few other classmates. Isaiah's stomach sank. He hadn't expected Troy to show up, especially not after weeks of radio silence. They hadn't spoken since before the exhibition was canceled, and Isaiah had all but written him off. Troy caught Isaiah's eye and gave him a small nod, almost as if he were asking for permission to be there. The sight of him stirred something in Isaiah. Anger, resentment, but also a flicker of hope. Maybe this was Troy's way of apologizing, of trying to make amends. Before Isaiah could decide how he felt about Troy being there, another figure caught his attention, a man standing near the back of the room, watching quietly from the shadows. Isaiah's breath caught in his throat as he recognized Mr. Holcomb. "What the hell?" Isaiah muttered under his breath. Malik followed his gaze, his eyes narrowing when he saw who it was. "Is that—" "Yeah," Isaiah said, his heart pounding. "What is he doing here?" Mr. Holcomb wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to show his face in public, Not after everything he had done. Isaiah's stomach churned with a mix of anger and disbelief. Did Mr. Holcomb think this was all some kind of game? Did he think he could just walk in here, like nothing had happened, and pretend to be part of the crowd? Isaiah started toward him, his hands clenched at his sides. But Malik grabbed his arm. "Yo, chill, man. Don't make a scene." Isaiah stopped, his pulse racing. Malik was right. This was his exhibition, his moment. He couldn't let Mr. Holcomb ruin it for him. But seeing the man here, in the space that was supposed to be Isaiah's safe haven, made his blood boil. Isaiah took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't let Mr. Holcomb win. Not now. Not after everything. He turned away, determined to focus on the people who had come to support him. But as the minutes ticked by, he could feel Mr. Holcomb's presence like a dark cloud hovering over the room. No matter where Isaiah went, no matter which piece of art he stood in front of, his eyes kept drifting back to the man in the corner. Eventually, he couldn't take it anymore. Isaiah approached Mr. Holcomb, his heart pounding in his chest. The man looked up, his expression unreadable as Isaiah came to a stop in front of him. "What are you doing here?" Isaiah demanded, his voice low but tense. Mr. Holcomb shifted slightly, glancing around the room before meeting Isaiah's gaze. "I came to see your work." Isaiah clenched his fists, his mind racing with 1,000 angry thoughts. "You don't get to do that," he said, his voice shaking. "You don't get to just show up here after what you did." Mr. Holcomb didn't react. He just stood there, watching Isaiah with the same calm, detached look he'd had the day the police had stopped him. "I didn't mean for things to go the way they did," Mr. Holcomb said, his voice quiet. Isaiah blinked, taken aback by the words. It wasn't an apology, not really. More like an excuse, and that only made Isaiah angrier. "You didn't mean for things to go the way they did?" Isaiah repeated, his voice rising. "You accused me of something I didn't do. You called the cops on me for walking down the street, and now you want to act like it's no big deal?" People around them had started to notice, their conversations quieting as they turned to watch. Malik was by Isaiah's side in an instant, his hand on Isaiah's arm, trying to pull him back. "Isaiah, let it go," Malik whispered urgently. "This isn't the place." But Isaiah couldn't let it go. Not now. Not after everything. "You ruined my life," Isaiah said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You made people think I was a criminal. You made me doubt myself, doubt everything." Mr. Holcomb's face didn't change. If he felt any remorse, he didn't show it. "I never meant for that to happen," he repeated, as if that somehow made it better. Isaiah shook his head, his chest tightening. "You don't get to be here. You don't get to look at my art, not after what you did to me." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was quiet now, all eyes on the confrontation. Isaiah could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him, but he refused to back down. Not this time. Mr. Holcomb looked around, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before he finally turned back to Isaiah. "I'll leave," he said simply, his voice devoid of emotion. "I just wanted to see." Isaiah didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to speak. He watched as Mr. Holcomb turned and walked out of the community center, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The tension in the room eased slightly as the door closed behind him, but Isaiah's heart was still racing. Malik sighed, shaking his head. "Man, I told you not to make a scene." Isaiah didn't answer. He stared at the door, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, frustration, and confusion. Mr. Holcomb had been there. He had seen Isaiah's work, and now he was gone. But the damage had already been done. The exhibition went on, people still wandering through the room, studying Isaiah's art. But the mood had shifted. Isaiah could feel it. The tension hadn't completely left the space, and now all he could think about was Mr. Holcomb's words echoing in his head. "I didn't mean for things to go the way they did." It wasn't an apology. It was just another way of saying he didn't care. Isaiah's fists unclenched, his anger slowly turning into something colder, something deeper. He had thought this exhibition would be a turning point, a way to take control of his story. But now he wasn't sure if that was possible. No matter how much he fought, the weight of what had happened would always be there, dragging him down. He had won, but it didn't feel like victory. Isaiah sat alone in his room, the soft hum of distant traffic barely audible through the window. The exhibition had ended hours ago, but the memory of Mr. Holcomb's calm, detached voice still rang in his ears. His words cut deeper than any apology could have, because they weren't really an apology at all. It was like he was saying, "It doesn't matter now." But it mattered to Isaiah. It mattered a lot. Isaiah stared at his sketchbook, open on the desk, but his hands were too shaky to pick up the pencil. His fingers twitched with frustration, the desire to draw something, anything, overwhelming. But every time he tried to start, he felt blocked, stuck, as if all the emotions he'd poured into his art had been drained by Mr. Holcomb's presence. His drawings had been meant to reclaim his narrative, but now they just felt like empty images, symbols that meant nothing. A soft knock on the door broke the silence. His mother's voice followed, low and careful. "Isaiah, can I come in?" Isaiah didn't respond immediately. He didn't want to talk. Not right now, not to anyone. Angela pushed the door open gently, stepping inside with a worried expression. "Hey, baby. You've been quiet since you got back from the exhibition. I just wanted to check on you." "I'm fine," Isaiah muttered, though he didn't feel fine. He felt hollow, like something important had been ripped out of him. Angela sat down on the edge of his bed, her hands folded in her lap. She watched him for a moment, her eyes scanning his face like she was searching for something. "I heard about what happened." Isaiah's jaw clenched. "Malik told you?" She nodded slowly. "He was worried about you." Isaiah let out a bitter laugh. "I'm fine. I handled it." Angela frowned, leaning forward slightly. "Did you? It doesn't seem like you're okay." Isaiah's gaze dropped to the floor. He showed up, Mom. Like it was nothing. Like he didn't care about what he did to me." Angela's expression softened, and she reached out, putting a hand on his shoulder. "I know it hurts, baby, but you can't let him have that power over you. He might never give you the apology you deserve, but that doesn't mean you have to let him control how you feel." Isaiah swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I thought the exhibition would fix things, that if I could just show people what I went through, it would help. But it didn't. It just made everything worse." Angela's hand squeezed his shoulder gently. "No, Isaiah. It didn't make things worse. You stood up for yourself. You told your story, and that matters. Even if it doesn't feel like a victory right now, it matters." Isaiah shook his head, his voice cracking with frustration. "But it doesn't feel like it mattered. He's still out there. People still think what they want to think about me. It didn't change anything." Angela sighed, her eyes sad. "Change takes time. Sometimes it feels like it's not happening at all, but that doesn't mean it isn't. You've already made a difference, whether you see it or not." Isaiah didn't respond. He didn't believe her. Not really. He wanted to believe it, wanted to think that his art had meant something, but right now, it just felt like more evidence that no matter what he did, he'd always be fighting this uphill battle, always trying to prove himself to people who had already decided he wasn't worth the effort. Angela stood up, giving him a soft pat on the back. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but just know that I'm proud of you, Isaiah, no matter what happens." When she left the room, Isaiah remained frozen in place, staring at the empty pages of his sketchbook. The longer he stared, the heavier the silence grew around him, until it felt like he couldn't breathe. He shoved the sketchbook off the desk, letting it clatter to the floor as he stood up abruptly. He needed air. He needed to get out. Isaiah found himself standing on a familiar street corner, the same corner where it had all started. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. His feet had carried him here without thinking, as if he had been drawn back to the place where everything had fallen apart. The street was quiet, the houses dark and still. Mr. Holcomb's house loomed ahead, its windows closed and its porch empty. Isaiah stood across the street, staring at the house that had caused him so much pain, so much fear. The memories rushed back. Mr. Holcomb's voice calling the police, the way the officers had looked at him like he was guilty before they even spoke. The weight of that accusation had never left him, not really. His hands balled into fists at his sides, his chest tightening with a surge of anger he couldn't control. He wanted to scream, to shout at the empty house, to make Mr. Holcomb understand what he had done. But there was no one to hear him, no one who would care. Isaiah took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. He had to let this go. Malik had been right. He couldn't let Mr. Holcomb control him. But it was easier said than done. Every time he thought he was moving forward, something pulled him back. As he stood there, lost in thought, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. Isaiah turned, his heart skipping a beat when he saw Troy walking toward him, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Troy?" Isaiah's voice was laced with surprise and suspicion. "What are you doing here?" Troy stopped a few feet away, his expression sheepish. "I was looking for you. Malik told me you'd probably be here." Isaiah narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Troy shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his shoes before meeting Isaiah's gaze again. "I wanted to apologize for disappearing, for not standing by you when all that stuff happened with Holcomb." Isaiah crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "Yeah, you did kind of disappear, didn't you?" Troy winced. "I know. And I'm sorry, I didn't know what to do. Everything got so crazy and I was scared. I didn't want to get dragged into it." Isaiah's anger flared. "Dragged into what? I didn't ask you to do anything. All I needed was for you to be my friend." Troy swallowed hard, guilt flashing in his eyes. "I know, and I messed up. I should have been there for you, but I wasn't. I get that now." Isaiah shook his head, the hurt and betrayal bubbling to the surface. "You think saying sorry is enough? Do you know how much that hurt? How much it sucked to have everyone turn against me and not know who had my back?" Troy looked down again, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Isaiah, I really am. I didn't mean to hurt you." Isaiah clenched his fists, the urge to yell, to scream, to lash out building inside him. But as he looked at Troy, standing there with his shoulders hunched and his face full of regret, something inside Isaiah softened. He was tired. So tired of being angry, tired of holding on to all the pain and frustration. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Isaiah said quietly, his voice raw with emotion. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." Troy nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "I get it. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. And if you ever need anything, I'm here." Isaiah didn't respond. He wasn't ready to let go of the hurt, but he wasn't ready to hold on to it either. He needed time. Troy gave him a small nod before turning and walking away, leaving Isaiah alone on the corner once again. The sun had set completely now, and the street was bathed in the cool, dim glow of twilight. Isaiah stood there for a long time, staring at Mr. Holcomb's house, his thoughts a tangled mess of anger, pain, and confusion. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to find out. The next morning, Isaiah woke up with a sense of heaviness that had become familiar over the past few weeks. The anger, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it weighed him down, but something felt different today. Maybe it was the conversation with Troy, or maybe it was the fact that Mr. Holcomb was out there living his life while Isaiah's felt frozen in place. Whatever it was, it left Isaiah feeling like he was standing on the edge of something, but he wasn't sure what. He sat up in bed, staring at his sketchbook on the floor. The pages were still blank, but they didn't mock him the way they had before. Instead, they felt like a challenge, a reminder that he still had something to say, something worth expressing. Isaiah got out of bed and picked up the sketchbook, flipping through the empty pages. His fingers hovered over the pencil for a moment, hesitating, before he finally picked it up. The first few lines were shaky, unsure, but as he drew, the tension in his chest started to ease. The image began to take shape, a street corner, much like the one where it all started, but this time, there was no squad car, no police lights flashing, just the quiet empty space, waiting for something new to happen. Drawing felt good again. It didn't fix everything, but it gave Isaiah a sense of control, a sense of purpose. The exhibition hadn't turned out the way he'd hoped, but it had still meant something. People had seen his work, had listened to his story. Even if it hadn't changed the world, it had changed something inside him. The door creaked open, and Angela peeked inside, a soft smile on her face. "You're up early," Isaiah nodded, still focused on the drawing. "Couldn't sleep." Angela came in, sitting on the edge of the bed as she watched him work. "You're drawing again." Isaiah shrugged. "Yeah, I guess I am." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet of the room filled only with the sound of pencil scratching against paper. Finally, Angela broke the silence. "I talked to the school again yesterday," she said, her voice careful. "I know the exhibition didn't go the way you wanted, but a few of your teachers are planning to showcase some of your work at the end-of-year event. It's not the same, but—" "It's okay," Isaiah interrupted, surprising even himself. "It doesn't matter." Angela looked at him, her brows furrowed. "It doesn't?" Isaiah shook his head. I mean, it matters, but not in the way I thought it would. I wanted the exhibition to fix everything, but I get it now. Nothing's going to fix this overnight. It's going to take time. Angela's eyes softened with pride, and she reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. You've grown a lot, Isaiah. I'm proud of you. Isaiah felt the warmth of her words, but it was bittersweet. He had grown, yes, but the cost of that growth had been high, and the bitterness of that truth lingered even as he tried to move forward. Thanks, he said quietly, though he still wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with all this newfound growth. Later that day, Isaiah found himself walking the familiar streets of his neighborhood again. The air was cool, crisp with the smell of fallen leaves, and for the first time in weeks, the weight in his chest felt a little lighter. As he passed by houses with tidy lawns and neat rows of mailboxes, he noticed that the neighborhood felt different too. People still stared at him as he walked by, but the looks weren't as sharp, as judgmental. Some of them even nodded at him, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had happened. When he reached Mr. Holcomb's house, he stopped. He hadn't meant to come this way, but his feet had carried him here without thinking. The porch was empty, the curtains drawn, but Isaiah knew Mr. Holcomb was inside. For a moment, Isaiah stood there, staring at the house that had been the epicenter of so much pain. His hands clenched at his sides, the anger bubbling up again, but this time it didn't consume him. It was there, but it wasn't everything. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs, and released it slowly. Isaiah didn't know if Mr. Holcomb would ever truly understand what he had done, or if he would ever feel the weight of the consequences the way Isaiah had. And Isaiah wasn't sure if that was something he could ever forgive. But standing there, in front of that house, he realized something important. He didn't need Mr. Holcomb's apology. He didn't need his validation. Isaiah wasn't fighting for Mr. Holcomb anymore. He wasn't even fighting for the people who had whispered behind his back, or the police who had treated him like a criminal. He was fighting for himself. Isaiah turned away from the house, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could face it. That evening, as Isaiah sat in his room, the weight of the day began to settle into his bones. He stared at the drawing on his desk, the street corner now fully realized on the page. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was a moment in time, a memory, a reminder of what he had been through and how far he had come. The sound of his phone buzzing pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Malik. Yo, you want to hang out later? Isaiah hesitated for a moment, then typed out a quick reply. Yeah, sure. He put the phone down and leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The anger, the pain, the confusion, it was still there, but it didn't control him anymore. He wasn't healed, he wasn't fixed, but he was okay, and that was enough for now.